And many of you know about climate change. Sure, but I was thinking it's more important to think about the role of deaf people in climate change, how we affect it, what we can do about it. And those two items are essential to talk about, and that's my focus today. My field is more in the environment and estuary, but climate change affects us all. Often people think, oh, 1 degree warmer is not a big deal. They are wrong, as you can see from this diagram. 2 IAU is 1 ice age unit. So we had a snowball Earth at -2, 1 IAU. And then -1, we had some ice, or excuse me, at 0 we have some. Everything looks fine now, kind of, but what will our future look like? By an increase of 2 degrees, our planet is going to overheat. It's not a joking matter. One thing is, we have a lot of climate change assessment available to us. The IPCC is an international body that reports every 2 to 3 years, but this is national climate assessment for the United States. Just came out in October. It provides a clear picture of the various impacts of climate change, and I'll go ahead and talk about each graph. So first of all, temperature. We know the temperature is rising. Maybe you don't believe that right now in the wintertime when it's cold and frozen outside, but the key with climate change is that it's not getting warmer. Yes, overall the globe is warming, but we're talking about severe kinds of weather. You have really cold snow in Arizona to drought in the Midwest to extreme weathers with extreme temperatures. So people can't predict the weather. When you open your door in the front, at the front of your house, you realize, okay, I'll dress for that because you can't really predict the weather. This will become even more of a factor in the future. And you can see the temperature change according to the map on the top left map. You can see that we are increasingly experiencing heat waves. So people are blasting their air conditioners and depleting energy. Heat waves are on the rise. Some places raise more. We're looking at C. I can tell you from DC, last summer it rained constantly. I think we had record rainfall last year. One student used to work with us. Remember it rained that one time on the boat? It rained and we were just drenched. Anyway, more frequent rainstorms are things that we are experiencing. Now, if you'll turn your attention to graphic D, snowfall and snowpack. One thing I don't think people realize is that snowpack is a crucial part of fresh water for us. So if the snowpack decreases, we'll have less water for drinking. And also some people think, oh, I want to go to Glacier National Park and see the glaciers. You better go now because we're not going to have future glaciers. Moving on to E. Drought. Droughts happen in the West, and that's where those fires happen on the West Coast, and also impacting the Midwest as well, and agricultural industry. Now onto Arctic sea ice extent. We see a decrease in the ice sheets, both in the Arctic and Antarctica. What's really interesting now in the Arctic, there is less ice, and in different countries have ships who are claiming territory for trade routes. Some countries are actually making icebreaker ships so they can get into the Arctic and getting into the Arctic so they can claim land. If you think about Russia, before they were landlocked, they might not be landlocked anymore because the ice sheet is melting. So defense and security issues are impacted by climate change as well. Moving on to U.S. sea level, graphic G. I'm sure some of you might have experienced sea level. Louisiana, for example, they've experienced lots of floods. Houston, Florida, even places like Venice. They've always had flood issues, but the issues are getting more dire now. So basically, I try to take people who live in Florida, you might want to sell your house now. Get out of Florida. You're going to be underwater in a few years. Now into graphic H, the U.S. marine species distribution. You have ocean acidification. The ocean is becoming more acidic, which is killing off the coral. And many animals don't do well in acid, so we're losing diversity rapidly in our oceans. If we lose diversity in the ocean, that will impact the fish industry. So again, many countries depend on fish as a large part of their diet for their protein source. So if fish are decreased in number, many countries will lose a protein source, which is critical for life. Maybe you drink wine, right? And you imagine Napa Valley or even French wine. Soon we won't have wine from Napa Valley or from France because everything has to move north. The Rhine producer region is moving north because of climate change. Next time around, we might get wine from Germany or England because northern parts of New York, hopefully New York, will have more wineries because of the climate change. The temperatures just aren't hospitable to growing grapes. Fires, we're going to talk more about the wildfires throughout this presentation, but they are on the rise. We're having more hot days and more extremely cold days. So again, climate change is about extremes in the weather. We don't have average temperatures. It's either all or nothing with our weather now. Any questions so far? I want to let you know you can interrupt me at any time. I'm happy to answer your question.
Talking about 30 years in the future, do you think water will cover Florida? What about Long Island? Should people be moving, and how will that impact, New York City? Will New York City disappear? I'm sure maybe they might want to move to the Midwest, and there will be additional tensions and cultural clashes as a result.
I'm reading a book right now called The Water Will Come by Jeff Goodell. He talks a lot about that. We have climate refugees. People will have to move from the coasts because of their homes being underwater. He talks a lot about Queens, New York, Hurricane Sandy, and how that affects the wetlands. Places under sea level, and a hurricane's going to come, your house is going to be underwater. Interestingly, though, there's a lot of politics and social impacts of climate change. For example, any state could decide, okay, we're going to buy all those homes in a floodplain. And some people say, I don't care, I'm going to stay until I die here. But those holdouts still need electricity, water, and emergency services. If you have a town of 5, it's going to be very expensive to provide that infrastructure to the entire town, even though they're living in a very risky area. So those are the politics we're dealing with. Also, there was a case in Florida where a very posh part of Florida, a neighborhood, Florida Highway 1A, every year it gets destroyed because of flooding and hurricanes. And the people who live there say, you have to fix it every year. The residents demand that it be fixed. It's a community of about 100 people. Is it really worth fixing the 1A every year? Or just learn to not use that road, navigate elsewhere? But they say, I pay taxes, therefore you will fix that road for me. But they're missing the big picture. They chose to live where they live, knowing it's risky. So there's a lot of social, political implications. Some people would move, and some people are not willing to move. So within our energy system, that is being impacted by climate change as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. So electrothermal power. If you have nuclear power plants, of course, they have backup generators. Of course, you want to make sure the generators are not in a place where the water is going to flood them. But a lot of nuclear power plants are in denial. They say, we're fine. We had 1 foot of water, we'll be fine. But the prediction is going to be many more feet than 1. If the sea level rises and then the generator stops and then you have a leak of radioactive material into that water, it's really disastrous. The power grid, I'm sure in some places where we have excessive heat waves, people turn up their AC and we have brownouts because the power grid is simply overwhelmed. So those are serious issues that are a direct result of climate change. Even very simple fuel transportation. You know, gas stations have to be fueled by those big fuel tankers. But if the road is underwater, how are we going to supply those gas stations? So we have a lot of impacts to our energy infrastructure that are caused by climate change that can be very detrimental.
Now in Georgia, they're setting up the pipe for oil to cross the country. I'm wondering how that's going to impact the future of the world.
We should not encourage the pipeline because that encourages our dependence on fossil fuels. If the government was smart, which I've hard to believe in this now day and age, however, just invest more in renewable energy. Renewables, yeah. Solar, wind, water, and the like. We should be investing in those. We need to have more incentives for those renewable energy rather than dependence on fossil fuel. It's also going to be hard to get oil because you have to drill through the permafrost. It's very difficult to drill that far into the earth. So if you're going to drill into the earth, what's the point of the pipeline?
There are a lot of leaks, I think, from the pipeline as well. And the repeated leak causes additional digging, and it's affecting localities along the pipeline where people live.
You're absolutely right. Leaks in the pipes and the pipes themselves prevent migration of animals. The deer on the plains can't get to where they need to be. So really, the oil pipeline should allow for animals to get through. But, you know, if a moose is trying to get around a pipeline, it's not going to look for an opening in the pipeline. So we really should not be encouraging pipeline. That's why the Native American peoples have been fighting the pipeline's establishment. You probably already understand the science behind climate change, but I'm just going to give you a brief primer, if I may. As you can see, we do have natural fluctuations of CO2 in our environment. You can see that more in the northern part of the world, there's much more red, and this is over time. Red means that there's a higher concentration of CO2. And you can see the years passing. You notice that summer is much different than winter. Take a look. So that's winter. Now I'm just wondering, why is there more CO2 in the winter than the summer? Do you want to answer? All right.
It's a loss of natural forests. I think that's the reason that people have destroyed the natural landscape and has destroyed the natural carbon dioxide process because of all the people instituted building and the deforestation. That's my opinion.
During winter, trees are dormant. They're not processing CO2. So in the summer, they're pulling more CO2 out of the environment. So that's what that natural ebb and flow looks like. But in the winter, they're dormant. Therefore, they're not processing carbon dioxide. CO2 levels have been rising throughout history. So we started at 2002, and you will see that the world becomes more and more red, indicating a higher level of CO2. A lot of climate change deniers say, we have a natural cycle of ebbs and flows in the planet. But what they don't realize is the following. It's the highest it's ever been in Earth's history. It's to the point where we have no idea of how it's going to affect our planet because it's the highest it's ever been in the history of the planet, as indicated by this visual. But I have to tell you a little bit of history behind climate change science. Pretty fascinating. In 1957, there was a scientist named Charles Keely. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work. They gave it to a group of scientists. He was one among them, who wrote the IPCC report. Charles Keeling was in that group. He also measured CO2 concentration in Hawaii. The reason he picked Hawaii is because there was very little effect of humans because it's in the middle of the ocean. If you want to visit that measuring station, you have to walk there, or you have to use an electric car to get there. There's no effects from people and cars in that area. I'll never forget, I watched Inconvenient Truth, that film, and you see him in a Harvard classroom, and he's talking about the increase in CO2. I was in the same classroom 20 years later, but anyway, by that time in 1959, they realized there's a relationship between CO2 on the rise that humans are contributing to and the rise in temperature. He made that connection. We call that the Keeling curve. The Keeling curve. Every year you see it ebbs and flows naturally. You can see winter and summer as the seasons change. It starts from 320 parts per million to today, where we're at 412 parts per million. So can you imagine people like Al Gore? He was in the Senate for over 20 years fighting for taking care of our environment, and the numbers are rising every year. I'm sure he's very disappointing because our government has not written a lot of legislation to decrease our CO2 emissions. So this is the measuring station, what it looks like in Hawaii. The reason why I have to tell you the story, because there's a deaf person in this story. There were deaf people involved, so we're going to talk about it. Keeling has a friend named Manning, who is a New Zealand scientist. So he established a measuring station in New Zealand, a second observatory. Now, moving on in our story. I call this the tale of two fathers and two sons. Okay? Now remember Charles Keeling. The graph is named after him, right? His friend is Manning, Martin Manning. Dr. Ralph Keeling is the son of Charles. Both are at UC San Diego. Keeling measures CO2, but his son measures oxygen. Dr. Manning's son is Andrew Manning, is the PhD advisor. Ralph Keeling was the PhD advisor for Dr. Keeling, and he is deaf. He's involved in a lot of measurements all over the world. He's now working in UK. He's been involved with IPCC and global measurements as a career. So just to let you know, there are a lot of deaf people involved in this work. Dr. Keeling and Manning, their work, they didn't just measure in one part of the world, they measured all over the world. So it was an international effort to measure CO2, some by plane, some from towers, some by simply measuring the water. So they used a variety of waves, and many different countries were involved in this effort.
Now we know about the greenhouse effect. We have the CO2 emissions being contained by the atmosphere. Now we also have the sunlight coming into the earth and trapping the sunlight from leaving when it's reflected because of CO2 emissions. But CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas. There's also methane. Now, if you love red meat, your friends' cows, those cows are the worst methane producers on the planet because cows have the habit of being flatulent. Maybe you might want to consider becoming a vegetarian. Carbon dioxide emissions come from a lot of industrial processes as well as land use. When already we had a person in the audience mention the deforestation. That's one example. Building of houses is another example. And then just fossil fuel combustions, using our cars and motor vehicles for transportation. Public transportation is one option. There's some countries that people don't own cars. They'll use other modes of transportation that don't require fossil fuel to power them. I was thinking about the different disasters. I was thinking about how the deaf responders respond to these disasters. So I have an example from Puerto Rico. And also the coral reefs in Florida. They are disappearing. And as well for Florida, I mentioned before, the sea level is rising. I've talked about the fires in the West, and they are continuing. Even the recent polar vortex that we experienced this past winter, we had to deal with that. And so these are not one-time occurrences, but they're becoming more periodic. But my question is, how are the deaf people impacted in these disasters? Of course, first and obviously, there's usually a lack of communication, a lack of access to communication, a lack of information that they need to evacuate, or even just what is going on. And it's interesting because, for example, I'm aware that the NOAA has the radio, but how can deaf people access the information from NOAA then if it's communicated through radio waves? Also, a second danger is a lack of power, and that means we don't have light to light up our evenings to help us communicate, and loss of technology because we don't have power to communicate our technology. And so there are people who have shared their experiences, and it's important for us to all recognize the immediacy of this need because people in the field are not thinking about disaster relief and disaster preparation and emergency preparation. Gallaudet is thinking about offering a certification in this area because they've seen a need. Most emergency preparers do not consider people with disabilities in their plans, and there will be continuing emergencies and continuing disasters that need to be addressed, and people with disabilities, including deaf people, will be part of those events. Now, on the left-hand side, you can see the picture of Puerto Rico before Hurricane Maria. On the right, the post-Puerto Rico dark landscape after Hurricane Maria. And that dark landscape shows that people did not have power to communicate.
One thing is Debbie Bronk. She is the president and CEO of Bigelow Laboratory of Ocean Sciences. And she got called to testify in front of Congress. And this was some of her testimony. She's saying the signs are telling us, and it's going to happen. We can't deny it anymore. If we do this, then it'll lessen the effect. No, it's now the time to mediate and adapt. We can't stop this. You have to mitigate and adapt. It will happen. There's no doubt. She said, I believe it's too late to rely on the approach to mitigate the severity of climate disruption. The carbon ship has left the sea and left us behind. We can't get back to port. And she's an oceanographer, so of course I'm an oceanographer, so I love that line. But we have to start thinking about how we're going to adapt to our new world. And we can't do anything to stop it, so therefore we must adapt. Just to give you some ideas of adaptations that you might try. What's happening in the West is after so many years of Smokey the Bear, decreasing forest fires, but honestly, that environment needs fire periodically. So when we suppress fire, the problem is it's just too close to people's homes. So we need to go ahead and use prescribed burns where we control the fire. There's too much fuel in the fire, the low underlying growth. Now we're experiencing more drought. We need more drought-resistant plants. You have to adapt. We're going to have to plant more drought-resistant plants. We have to start thinking about the flood threat. Maybe instead of a car, we're going to use a boat to get to work. I mean, it's going to be part of our new reality. We have to do a lot of research of how to divert water and how to move water. For example, in Israel, they're already building a lot of desalination systems to remove salt from the water so it's drinkable. So there are many different ways for us to adapt. What are our policymakers doing? Of course, we have IPCC, the panel, in the 1990s. I remember that time period because I was in college. Don't make any remarks about my age. I remember being excited. The first big meeting in Rio. It was a voluntary agreement by the countries, and nothing happened. Now, moving on. The first meeting was in Rio, and then the next one was in Kyoto with Al Gore, who was going to Kyoto. We're going to sign this agreement, but Congress never signed it. Congress has to sign all international agreements. So again, that fell apart. And then Copenhagen happened in 2009, which again was voluntary. Finally, the Paris climates were no longer voluntary. Almost every country in the world signed this agreement in the Paris Climate Change Accords. Now, some people say Trump pulled out of Paris, but you can't do that in 2 years. We're not out yet. There's still time to get back in. But we need to make sure we get back in on this agreement. The U.S. has not been great at implementing policy change. For example, cars. Many other countries have standards for miles per gallon in their cars that they produce and allow on their streets. ours is ridiculously low compared to Europe. In Europe, they're much more strict about it because it's very expensive to buy a car. Fuel is expensive. In US, the price of gas is ridiculously cheap. There's not a lot of incentive to save gas. Also, investing in renewable energy is not in evidence here in the United States, although it's happening by leaps and bounds in Europe. So our politicians need to have the courage to make these changes and bold steps. So what can you do as individuals? Remember, politics are local. You can lobby for more effective communication systems on a local level during disaster, and also through the FCC. You can simply, like that woman said off the grid, you can send supplies to deaf individuals impacted by disaster. Or maybe you could join a gym that uses electric bicycles. Or even ride your bike to work. Maybe not today, perhaps. You have to vote for politicians who believe in climate change and support change in policy. So this is the change you can affect from local to national and international levels.